Okay, so welcome everyone. So my name is Patrick Paul Walsh, and I'm the president of the society. So welcome to the second ordinary meeting of the 177th session. So we have a paper today entitled "The Regional Location of Indigenous and Foreign Manufacturing Establishments 1929 to 1975, Evidence from a Repopulation of the Census of Industrial Production," from Professor Frank Barry and Michael Schwartz from the Trinity Business School. It will be followed by Bola Tanks from Brownlow from Queens and Alan de Bromhead from UCD. I'm just going to hand it over to the secretary just for minutes of the last meeting, and then we can have the paper.
Hi everyone. The first ordinary meeting of the 177th session was held on the 26th of October 2023. At the meeting, Patrick Conahan presented a paper entitled "Distinctive Features of the Irish Banking Crisis." This was proposed by Niamh Hardiman, School of Politics and International Relations, UCD, and seconded by Carl Whelan, School of Economics, UCD. And this was followed by an interesting discussion with contributions from the floor. Thank you.
So, okay. Frank, the floor is yours.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks to all who were in attendance, both personal, in person, and online. Right. Okay, so that's the full title, rather long-winded title, but I'll explain to you. Start by explaining the origins of the project. Yeah, okay. So as some of you might be aware, this is a recent book of mine. It's come out in the last couple of months. And amongst the things that I do here is that I identify the largest manufacturing employers from the 1920s through to the 1970s. And that's it. So by large, I mean employment of 500 or more. So these are the firms that I identify. And as I've been explaining at recent seminars, this was a long, arduous project because there are no lists of such firms. So this is really a first. So there were about 15 firms employing 500 or more in the 1920s, rising to over 70 in the early 1970s. So I'd identify those, but amongst the things that readers of the manuscript said to me is, I should look in more detail at the regional dispersion of industry. And as I explained, that's actually quite a different project because firms will have many different factories. And if the factories are in different locations, then you need to track where the factories are and you need to track the employment numbers in the factories. So as every school child in Ireland used to learn, Irish Sugar had 4 factories, Mallow, Carlow, Tuam and Thurles. They're all in different counties, right? So it's not enough to know the firms that are big, you need to know the factories. And finding employment data for the factories is tougher than it is for the firms overall. So fortunately, I turned to a great former student of mine and my co-author on the present paper, Michael Scholz, who he was an undergrad student of mine, and then I hired him as a research assistant, and I've really been lucky with research assistants I've hired over the years. He did sterling work, and then he came back to Trinity to do an MSc in business analytics, and he suggested to me that he might do the dissertation based on the database that I've accumulated over the last 20 years, which has about 5,000 manufacturing firms, pretty much every manufacturing firm of any significance in Ireland over that entire 50-year period I have in the database. So Michael worked through the database for his master's thesis and was able to identify the large factories. So I'll explain what I mean by large. So the largest size category, and really the Bible that we're working off here, is the Census of Industrial Production. It divides for establishments or factories into different size categories. The largest one is 500 employees plus. The second largest consistent category are establishments that employ between 100 and 499. So Michael went through and identified for about 5 years or so, interspersed between 1929 and 1975, about 5 years, including those 2 years, identified the vast majority of these large and medium-sized factories. And so we're able to group them into these size categories. Why this is of interest is that as was said in the 1970s by one of the people who worked on regional policy and regional issues, as you can see there, what he said, no single development problem has generated so much controversy and emotion as the concept of spatially polarized growth. You see, every electoral constituency in the country, and even down to the parish level, wanted their own factory, and they put a lot of pressure on politicians to do what they could to locate factories in the region where these interest groups resided. So it was hugely controversial and a matter of great political interest. Amazingly, given that it was of such huge political interest, the existing data on the regional dispersion of these factories is very, very sparse for reasons that I'll explain. But to mention something about the controversy that exploded, and it was very heated in the 1960s, Whitaker, in his Economic Development Report of 1958, included the following statement: a realistic appraisal of development projects indicates that apart from exceptional cases, industries must be at or near the larger centres of population. Special subsidization of remote areas by more extensive grants for industrial development is wasteful and retards progress in areas better situated. Now, that's not something that politicians can live with, given the pressures that they're getting from regional interest groups. This had been a long-standing position in the Department of Finance, was that essentially regional policy didn't make a lot of sense for a small economy like Ireland. But politicians obviously have to listen to the Department of Finance, but they also have to listen to competing electoral interests as well. So this bit of the Whitaker report did not appear. It was one of the few bits of the Whitaker report not to appear in the subsequent first programme for economic development. It was jettisoned for political reasons. And ultimately, responsibility for regional policy devolved to the IDA, the Industrial Development Authority. And it was a big issue in the 1960s. Probably most people are familiar, or at least know the name of the Buchanan Report of 1969, that advocated concentrating industries in 9 growth centres. The IDA really countermanded that, or really said that we're not going to adhere to the Buchanan report. So the Buchanan report was jettisoned. And in the IDA regional development plans for the early 1970s, only 50% of the job targets were located in these 9 growth centres identified by Buchanan. Now, I'd mentioned that there's actually little hard data on the regional dispersion of industry until the early 1970s. And why is that? Well, it is that the Census of Industrial Production and the CSO generally is very constrained in what it can report by the need to maintain firm level confidentiality. So it can't reveal data that would allow competing firms to identify market sensitive data, which would include the levels of employment of individual firms. So you can see here, this is from the 1929 Census of Industrial Production. It says, in order not to disclose the business of any individual concern, figures are shown separately only for those counties or cities in which at least 3 establishments were engaged in production. So you can't go through the Census of Industrial Production and identify where individual industries are located, because it gives you only this kind of opaque information. And furthermore, it didn't report on the employment distribution of manufacturing per se, again, for the same reason, because some counties might only have, one manufacturing firm of significance. So it aggregated manufacturing with building and construction and mining, quarrying and turf, which might make up, say, 15% of the aggregate or so on. So again, it needed to hide any potentially sensitive firm level information. So the information available, even though this is a very political issue, the information on where industry was actually distributed over this period is actually quite sparse. So what we do know, that this is the aggregate that I just mentioned there, that aggregates manufacturing and building and construction is, of course, another big sector. Mining, quarrying and turf, not so big. The regional distribution of industrial employment over the decades is shown here. These are data from the Census of Industrial Production. And I have Dublin City outlined at the top there. So surprisingly, given all these pressures that politicians were under to redistribute industry around the country, there seems to be actually very little change in the regional distribution of industry over that entire period, 1931 to 1970, up to the 1960s. There's almost no change in the share of this aggregate industrial employment located in Dublin. And then we see a sharp drop between 1963 and 1972. The B after 1972 says these 1972 numbers are not on the same basis as the previous set of numbers. Again, building and construction is removed from the 1972 data, which means, again, it's just hard to isolate exactly what's going on. But the received wisdom anyway is that there was little change in the share of manufacturing and this broader aggregate up until the mid to late 1960s, and then something happened that caused the share in Dublin to change. So Mary Daly, in her work on the Ireland of the 1920s and 1930s, suggests that the more intensive drive for decentralisation under Fianna Fáil in the 1930s appears to have been ineffective. And again, as I say, this is surprising because there was a lot of pressure on the government to redistribute industries. And one thing we know about protectionism is that in protectionist regimes, a lot of power is centralized in the hands of politicians, of government ministers who can put more pressure on industries as to where they locate. They don't need to use special grant schemes or whatever. They have a lot of power residing in the ministry themselves. So this is a surprising result then, and Mary Daly clearly found it surprising as well. So some people have said, okay, the Census of Industrial Production is restricted in terms of what we can read from it. So maybe we can use the census of population, right? The census of population, of course, though, tells us where individuals reside rather than where they work. And it is recognized that for that reason, it's not an adequate proxy for the census of industrial production. Also, but a bigger and more important fact in many ways is the changing degree of overlap between the census of population and the census of industrial production. In 1926, when these two censuses were produced for the first time for the new Irish state, the level of manufacturing employment recorded in the census of industrial production, which is the one we'd like to replicate. This is the one that isolates where manufacturing establishments are. That comprised only 48% of the aggregate manufacturing employment recorded in the census of population. And this changed over time. So some researchers have used the population census as a proxy, but it's actually a very bad proxy, not just because it measures something different, but also because, as you can see here, there's a massive change in the degree of overlap between the census of industrial production and the census of population. Why is that? The census of population includes individuals, say, working as electricians or so on, besides electricians working in factories. And it also includes, say, and also there's lots of individuals recorded in the census of population who are working in micro establishments that don't meet the size criteria to be included in the census of industrial production. So they're not adequate proxies for each other. So it's dangerous because of the changing overlap. But you see, by 1981, there was a huge overlap between the two, very little overlap in the 1920s. So it's very difficult to track the pattern of regional distribution using the population census because of this the changing time profile of the two censuses. So I'm going to return to the census of industrial production, which is again the one that we would like to replicate, because the census of industrial production, the census of population, as you know, goes to every household and every individual is supposed to be recorded in it. Census of industrial production is distributed to establishments or factories. And so it records something different. It records factory employment, which is what we'd like to get at in measuring the regional distribution of industry. So we've seen we've seen an apparent high degree of stability in terms of the regional distribution of industry from the Census of Industrial Production until the mid to late 1960s. And then unfortunately, in 1973, the Census of Industrial Production changes how it reports the data, and it no longer reports data by city and county. It now starts to report data by the new planning regions that came into effect in the 1960s. So that makes it more difficult to track what had happened beyond 72, 73. Okay, so just to remind you, what we get from the Census of Industrial Production so far is apparent quite a high degree of stability in the regional location of industry until the mid to late 1960s, and then the Dublin share dropped sharply. So in the early 1970s, the IDA started to conduct essentially a census called the Annual Employment Survey, but pretty much very high coverage. And we know from the IDA data that we can track what happened between 1972 and 1975, which is the end of our period of analysis. And we know Dublin's share continued to drop between 72 and 75. So that confirms the pattern that we've seen already. And then the IDA, thanks be to God for the IDA, collects good data, though a lot of the data that I'm referring to now is apparently no longer available. It hasn't been kept. The IDA employment survey is now continued on. It was continued by FIRFOS and now by the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. The data I'm going to refer to here is data in new industry. This is essentially post-1956 industry. So 1956 is the important year because that's when export profits tax relief was introduced, and when the Irish foreign direct investment strategy emerged, the strategy of attracting in export-oriented FDI. And from Dermot McAleese, a paper again going back to the 1970s, he shows this interesting result. This is the nature, this is the pattern, the regional distribution of post-1956, essentially foreign-owned, export-oriented industry compared to aggregate manufacturing. And we see that these new industries, so these post-1956 export-oriented industries, were much more likely to locate in the least developed regions of the country and in the Midwest region, which is now the responsibility of the Shannon Free Airport Development Company. In other words, this includes the Shannon Free Zone, which came into being in the 1960s. And the Eastern region, which includes Dublin, is really not keeping ahead, remaining ahead of the game in terms of its ability to attract this new export-oriented foreign industry. So the presumption has been that this new export-oriented foreign industry was being directed either by regional grants or by IDA staff, been directed to locate not in the Eastern region, the Dublin region, but in the peripheral, more peripheral areas of the country. And then Shannon was its own development zone, and it was attracting, of course, a lot of US FDI at the time. So the received wisdom I condense into these two bullet points. First is that little change. So this is the received wisdom. What we know, what we think we know from the data so far, the research that's been conducted over the decades so far, is little change in the regional distribution of industry from the 1920s until the late 1960s. And then a decline in Dublin's share. So something changes around that time. And the presumption has been, the second bullet point here, that this decline in Dublin's share is primarily due to the differential relocation pattern of new export-oriented foreign firms. These are either choosing to locate beyond Dublin, or they're being incentivized by the IDA and the Shannon Development Authority to locate beyond Dublin. So those are the two bits of received wisdom that's really essentially pretty much the state of knowledge so far for this period on the basis of what can be discerned both from the Census of Industrial Production and the IDA data. So what we do, so that's all by way of introduction. Sorry, very long way of introduction. So I'm gonna hand over to Michael in a few minutes, and he's going to do the hard stuff. Well, actually, the maps. He doesn't regard it as hard. Of course, I regard it as hard. What we do in this paper, right? So we identify the medium and the large scale establishments, right, from the vast database that I've been collecting over the last 20 years, and that Michael assisted with as a research assistant. So we identify the medium establishments. This is the really hard one. The medium-sized establishments are the ones employing between 100 workers and 499 workers. And the large-scale establishments are factories or plants or creameries or breweries, anything of that nature that employ 500 workers and more. So we identify all of these, or pretty much all of these, we've managed to identify. And once you identify them, you know their location. So that's how we're able to piece, the regional distribution of industry together. What's going on there? I'm missing. Oh, I'll have to fill in the blanks then. I don't know what that red dot there. You see, that's really important. Listening from that. Again, I go back to the 1929 Census of Industrial Production, and it tells us there's a category called bread, biscuits, and flour confectionery, and it tells us there are 2 large establishments in that category in the state. It doesn't tell us where they are, but I know where they are because I've been working on this for so long. In fact, I published an entire paper 5 years ago on the 1929 location of these large ones. So that round dot there says 2 large establishments in bread, biscuits, and flour confectionery. Most people can probably name one of them, which is this one, the Jacobs factory, which is now TUD, Technological University of Dublin, down off Ainger Street, right? The other big one was Boland's Bakery, down on Grand Canal Street. They were the 2 big ones in bread, biscuits, and flour confectionery. So once you're able to identify them, you know where they are, right? So so that's that's really what you wanted to do. So both of those were in Dublin. And now the next dot is the one large establishment in sugar, jam, and sweet confectionery. This is the Census of Industrial Production category. And this one, again, I know from working at this long enough, this is the Williams and Woods factory just north of Parnell Street, right? So it was taken over. The Cumann and Whale government introduced what's called experimental protectionist tariffs. One of the main one, or well, the 2 big ones, one on tobacco, which came in automatically. The other one that was chosen by the government was on this sector. And Williams and Woods was the big factory at the time, and it was taken over by the British firm Cross and Blackwell. So again, we know that's in Dublin. So that's how we piece together the regional distribution by identifying the large factories and the medium-sized factories, and then working out where their location is. So this is from the Census of Industrial Production with slight adjustment. So there were 9 large factories in 1929, but later on the Census of Industrial Production included railway engineering works in this category. So there was 2 of those, one of them still in existence, which is the big CIE works in Inchicore. It was it was a huge establishment, right? And the other one, the Great Northern Rail Works in Dundalk. So essentially we had 11 large manufacturing type factories in 1929, rising to 52 by 1975. So they are, I was going to say they're easy to identify, but they're easy if you've been working at this stuff for 20 years. But Michael, like I say, did the hard work, because these are the second tier of factories that employ between 100 and 499, and obviously there's many more of those, and Michael succeeded in identifying the vast bulk of these. So that's how we piece together the regional distribution of manufacturing industry over this period. And why does this matter? Why why does it matter? And it matters amongst other reasons, any locality would be, if you're talking about a small rural area factory that's going to employ 200 people is a really big deal for that locality. But also, and it's a finding not just for Ireland, but for all over the world, developed and the developing world, that average labour compensation rises with the size of both of the factory and the size of the firm. And these are data for 1958. Kieran Kennedy and Tom Healy showed these data for the 1970s, but it's an empirical regularity all over the world, so it's not anything to do with Ireland. But that means, that if a small rural locality manages to attract a big factory, that's a big deal, not just because it creates lots of jobs, but these are relatively well-paying jobs. So that's of course why this was such a big political issue. Now, just to note that we're characterizing establishments by their employment category. So our results are not in terms of, 40% of manufacturing jobs in Dublin, to the extent that we're able to relate to the existing literature, we're able to say X% of these significant establishments are located in Dublin. Okay, and very briefly, the results for the large establishments, there was 11 large establishments in 1929, as we saw. All of them were located in 4 counties: Dublin, Cork, Louth, and Offaly. By 1975, these remained highly concentrated in those 4 counties, 75%. Most of them, of course, were in Dublin and Cork, but Louth had, Mike's going to talk about the footwear firm. Offaly had a strong industrial tradition. Actually, even though my mother's from Offaly, I hadn't realized Offaly had a strong industrial tradition, primarily due to the Goodbody family, so these large establishments remain concentrated in these 4 counties. Certain subsectors remain particularly concentrated in Dublin throughout, and I am. Yeah. Oh, good. I'm almost. Yeah, I think this is actually second last slide. Bread, biscuits, and flour confectionery as a percentage of industrial production category remained highly concentrated in Dublin. Why throughout the entire period from the 20s to the 70s? Why all the big factories in this category were located in Dublin? Jacobs was there throughout, intermittently Boland's bread, Boland's biscuits, which was in Dean's Grange, Johnson, Mooney and O'Brien in things in Bowles Bridge. So this was a highly Dublin-centred or Dublin-centric sector. Similarly for cocoa, chocolate and sweet confectionery, there's the Williams and Woods factory, Ernie in Tala, Rowntree Mackintosh in Kilmainham, and Cadbury, which was initially in East Wall and later in Coolock. So this sector remained concentrated in Dublin throughout. Similarly for drink, of course, Guinness was the huge one. Tobacco was very concentrated in Dublin. The sole large establishment outside Dublin was Carroll's factory in Dundalk. And paper, print and publishing. So there's about, in the Census of Industrial Production, there's about maybe 25 different industries distinct. These are the ones that were highly concentrated in Dublin throughout. And just the last point that I'm going to make about this is that these sectors shed jobs significantly over that period, 1963 to 1975, when we see the Dublin drop, right? So my point is, the drop in Dublin's share of manufacturing employment had a lot to do with the fact that new foreign industry was locating in the peripheral regions or outside Dublin, but there was other things going on as well. EFTA, which is the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Area Agreement, was introduced a fair degree of trade liberalisation to the economy, and then of course we joined the EEC in 1973. So these sectors shed labour and declined as a share of manufacturing workforce. Sectors that were concentrated outside Dublin, like beef processing and dairy, expanded quite substantially as a consequence of the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement and ultimately as when we joined the EEC, and these expanded. So what we get from this is that the decline in Dublin's share wasn't solely a consequence of, the differential location pattern of the new export-oriented foreign firms. And then I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks. So that was what we're going to take a look at now is actually the underlying data that has been researched. So obviously this is a ground up research where we're looking at individual establishments. And this table here shows us the progression of the number of establishments or large establishments from the period of 1929 to the 1970s. And what Frank already mentioned, in 1929, we got 11, if we include the railway engineering works, large establishments in the Free State with just 4 counties. And this number goes up to 13 by the 1970s. And you can see here, each row represents a county. And you can see the addition of new counties as the time period progresses. And what I have done here also in the colors, we've got 3 colors representing 3 different foreign ownership classifications. So we've got green representing tariff jumping firms. We've got blue acquired foreign firms, mostly also tariff jumping ones. And then later down in the years, we've got export oriented firms establishing in Ireland. And what's very interesting that we observe that the foreign tariff jumping firms, they mainly settle down in the original 4 counties that we see in 1929 and in the 30s, whereas later down in the years, we see the export-oriented firms also establishing in those counties, but then, as we can see here, if I go down, they choose to settle in the newer counties, so the new entrants to the or hosts of the large establishments. So we've got Shannon, Limerick, Kerry, Sligo, Galway, and Mayo, some of which we'll discuss later as being part of the congested and designated areas, the focus of the government to locate there, to disperse. Yes. Oh, and sorry, and one thing to mention here is when you're looking at these tables and also the graphs, when we have a county disappear, let's say Carlow or Westmeath, doesn't necessarily mean that they were closed or disappeared. They may have dipped under the 500 mark. So Carlow, for example, would be Irish Sugar. Westmeath is Gentex, both establishments that continued to operate beyond those years. The second. Right. So then we've got a visualization of the same table that we've just seen here. And these are the maps. So the 6 years that we looked at, 1972 is actually one of the years where we didn't have the Census of Industrial Production data. However, that's an interpolated amount and also, again, a bottoms-up research where we identified individual establishments. As I said, it's a heat map. So we've got, and hopefully you can observe here, from light green to a darker shade of green, representing a higher portion of these large 500 plus employment establishments. And very quickly, what you'll see here, and hopefully it comes across, Dublin actually goes up to almost 2/3 of all the large establishments in 1938, a number that drops down to 40% by the 1970s. And that obviously at the expense or the beneficiaries of that being the West. As you can see, by the 1970s, you've got Connacht and also the Southwest gaining significantly in that share. Interestingly enough as well, by the 1970s, 25% of all of these establishments locate in counties that did not host large establishments in the 1930s. So here we've got a similar map. Again, the numbers are the same. I've taken away the heat map elements, and here we're focusing on the nature of the ownership, and in fact, the foreign ownership of these establishments. So in the very beginning, in the early years, we're seeing tariff jumping firms establishing across the different counties. In 1929, we've only got 2 in Dublin. I believe that's the Tobacco and I think Cross Williams and Woods. By 1938, Dunlop and Ford actually later was classified as a tariff jumping firm. 1947, we've got Louth with the footwear factories, two of them, and Offaly joining in with the Scholz yarn factory in Tullamore. By 1963, we've got a few entrants also through foreign acquisitions. And by 1972, the picture changes because we've got new entrants for export-oriented firms, and also these, as you can see, locate on the west. So we've got in Sligo, Snaya, producing synthetic fibers. We've got factories in Clare, in Limerick, we've got Ferenca and Kerry. In fact, two clothing factories between Kerry and Limerick. And what you see is that there are actually more entrants of the export-oriented nature on the west than there are in the strong hubs in Dublin, Louth, and Offaly, the first, I guess, counties to host such big factories. And let me see if there's anything else. Yes, and also in terms of the export-oriented firms, the nature in Dublin, they're mainly electronics companies. So second table here, another part of the research focused on the designated areas. So they've been known under different names. So initially called the congested areas, we kept a static approach of looking at the same area and how that area progressed in its share of large establishments. This table adds in also the medium-sized establishments, so establishments between 100 and 499. And the first line is something that we've already seen. The total count of such medium and large establishments, which goes up to 445 by 1975. And then Dublin's shares in line 2, and you can see that Dublin increased its share or total count of the medium and large establishments almost threefold. However, the share on line 3 is a negative line. Actually, you can see it drops by 13% in its total share of such large and medium establishments. Whereas when we look at the designated area, and then I'll show also on the map later what this area is comprised of, goes up almost sixfold. And also when you see its share of 100 plus establishments out of all of the establishments, it also goes up from 7.6% to almost 14% by 1975. Curiously, if you then compare the two, the ratio also decreases. So in 1929, you have about 6.2 Dublin establishments of this nature compared to 1 in the designated area, which drops down to 2.5 by 1975. This map here is also an interesting one that shows us the change year on year of the years that we looked at. 1929 is in gray, so these are establishments, medium and large establishments that already, or counties that had such establishments. That's the base year. And if you can see here, we've got a color scaling in green, where a county gained in its total share of such establishments, and in orange and red if it had a loss. So what Frank already mentioned, very curious, by 1938, we actually have both Dublin and Cork lose more than 1.5%, together actually almost 10% of its total share of such establishments at the cost of, and then you see some of the biggest gaining counties, Galway, Sligo, and Mayo together comprise of almost 3% of that gain. So already as early as 1938, you see that the western counties and the peripheral counties start gaining, again, at the expense of Dublin and Cork. However, what I should also mention is that when you look at just the heat map of who has the total or the largest share of such establishments, Dublin and Cork still come out on top. So this is just a year-on-year change, just to show how the share progresses over time. And the picture remains largely the same. So when we look into 1963 and into the 70s, the Western counties typically stay in the green territory, so they keep on gaining, whereas Dublin and Cork, again, the traditional big hubs for such establishments, continue to drop in their share. So here is what I spoke to. So the designated area had lots of different definitions over the years. We took a static approach. So what you see there on the left, the counties, Connacht, you've got Donegal, and also Kerry and Western Cork, which was defined as being west of Carrigaline, and Turk, Macroom, and Charleville. So excuse my drawing, that's actually my line there. And what I've already mentioned there, and also, sorry, also excludes the Shannon free zone. The ratio that was discussed earlier on, 1929, you have a 6.2 to 1 ratio of Dublin to designated area, which drops down to 2.5 in 1975. And I think I had a note on here. Yes, so Dublin had almost 50% of such establishments in 1929, and that share drops to almost 1/3 by the 1970s. And similar for Cork, it had about 20%, and that drops down to 12% by the 1970s. And finally, this map here, again, going back to the nature of the ownership of such establishments. In early years, obviously we wouldn't have seen any export-oriented firms yet. The foreign tariff jumpers tend to locate themselves in Dublin, and the designated area benefits very little from those firms. Whereas by 1963, we start seeing 6 new export-oriented firms of the size of 100 and plus, and all 6 of them actually locate in the designated area. Of course, this excludes all the other areas. We're just comparing Dublin and the designated area. And those 6 firms, they include, for example, Cadbury and Rathmore and Kerry. And we've got 3 metals and engineering companies, firms as well. By 1972, this picture goes, changes slightly. You've got Dublin also adding to its export-oriented establishments. However, again, on par with the designated area, and this tips over again by 1975 towards the designated area, which has 19 such establishments, whereas Dublin has 12. And I think that,
okay, and I'm going great, and I'm going to speak for about 2 more minutes then.
Yeah.
No, that's, can we turn it off?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, actually, we're ahead of time. I'll speak for 15 minutes. No, I won't. Don't worry. No, it's fine. It's as long as we haven't cut off everybody who's. No. So just to summarize, kind of then the key takeaways that we get from this. First of all, the very high degree of concentration continuing throughout the entire period of the large establishments, you know, so that's 75% of large establishments in 1975. We're still in the 4 counties where all the large establishments were concentrated in the 1920s. And no difference, we haven't talked so much about this, but no difference in the behavior of tariff jumping foreign firms that came into Ireland under protectionism and Indigenous firms. Now, you might expect the tariff jumping foreign firms to be more amenable to government pressure to locate elsewhere, but in fact, we don't see any differential pattern between the tariff jumping foreign firms and Indigenous firms. They were both equally concentrated in the main initially industrialized areas. And then to talk about the entire category of medium and large establishments, that is all the establishments employing 100 and more workers, the periphery gains pretty much throughout the entire period. So it puts a somewhat different perspective on, you know, the Mary Daly quote that I gave you earlier on, which is that there seems to be little change in the regional distribution of industry, even in the 1930s, when a lot of pressure was coming on firms to locate in outside Dublin. So from the aggregate sort of census of industrial production data, that seems to be correct. When we look at these medium to large category establishments, there does seem to have been an increase in the share of those locating outside Dublin, with presumably corresponding beneficial labour compensation effects, because these larger and medium and large establishments pay better wages and salaries. So the periphery would have gained in terms of attracting those medium and not so much the large establishments, but the medium establishments. It would have gained in terms of labour compensation. So there would have been advantageous consequences for them. So that's, there are some key takeaways. In terms of where we can go with this, a big question that we both have is, so we saw, right, under protectionism, that there was industry remained concentrated essentially on the east and south coast, and then under export orientation, industry became much less concentrated on the east and south, and was much more prepared to locate, whether incentivized to do so or by choice, in the western areas. The presumption has been that this was because of IDA policy and regional grants and so on. But it's very difficult to disentangle that just from the passage of time. So amongst the other things that were happening as time passed was products became lighter. So with these new multinationals, the export-oriented multinationals, transport costs would have been less significant for the kind of products that they were producing than was the case in the older protectionist era industries. So that would have made them less reliant on locating on the East Coast and locating close to Dublin. Regional infrastructure was probably improving all the time. Worsening urban congestion would have been another factor pushing them away from the established areas, and there's regional aid. So it's difficult to disentangle that bunch of things. And some econometric work has been done on this, but we think there's a potential for econometric work to be done on our database that might allow us disentangle some of those effects, particularly the fact that we have sector region pairs. In other words, we know the kind of industries that were located in the Western region, and that gives us the kind of information that could be used to see whether this increasing lightness of manufactured products did indeed have an effect in making the peripheral areas more attractive to firms as time progressed. So that's something that we think there's the potential to do. And the other thing is the analysis of firm performance by region has been quite perfunctory because of the data, and there's the limited data that's available, and we think more work could be done on that. But just to caution, these are, every piece of data here is handcrafted with Michael's tender loving care, and it's not something that we can just go to and say, when did such an establishment close down? Each establishment has to, and we've got hundreds and hundreds of establishments, each establishment has to be worked on to figure out when it closed down. So you will all no doubt say, oh yeah, you can do this, that, and the other with these data, but just remember, there's an awful lot of work still to be done on this. And actually, I'd kind of forgotten, Cormac, you were one of the people who had suggested that I do with my original database, that I do this kind of regional task. And I said, oh, it's a whole extra amount of work. So this is kind of, and Owen McLaughlin said the same, so suggested the same thing, that we look at the regional allocation, so you can see it's an extra batch of work that has to be done. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Rain Barlow from Queens to give a first vote of thanks.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Yeah, so I'll obviously start with the traditional thanks for the fine paper, and more generally, I should say to Frank, congratulations on the recent book and keeping the torch of Irish business history alive, and thank to Michael for the empirical and map aspect of the presentation, all very interesting. what I want to talk about very briefly in my comments are observations in two categories, and again, some suggestions for future direction of research. And the two areas I want to concentrate on, one in more detail than the other, because I suspect Alan in much more detail can talk about the other. I want to talk a little bit about the issue about firms and industries, so establishment and size. And the second category is sort of trade, governance, political economy. So in terms of the issue, very interesting, rich material, including Boland's, Jacobs, etc., it struck me that when we're thinking about these businesses, we're not just thinking about factories. We're thinking in a microeconomic sense about firms. Okay, and they're not exactly the same because, of course, there's organizational structure of make or buy decision within firms. And also we think about firms, we think about their resources and capabilities, strategic management scholars and business schools go on about this. So I think Frank in his comments towards the end, when he talked about the similarities of tariff jumpers and Indigenous firms, I think there's a clue there, because I think a lot of the issues arise for trying to understand what's going on are about firms and industries. So, unpacking that more, if we think about different industries, of course, have very different sort of issues regarding, say, R&D intensity. And we know from, say, Michael Best, when he talked about more recent Irish figures, even when Ireland's performed much better in terms of growth in industry, in terms of R&D data, there hasn't always been a good performance in terms of R&D. And part of that is sectoral, the sectoral mix. That sectors like the food manufacturing type sector, perhaps there's less scope for the R&D expenditures than in some of the more high-tech industries. So this sort of idea about an innovation deficit, perhaps there might be something to look at in terms of the origins of that sort of innovation deficit. And again, it isn't, as Frank, I think, is alluding to, isn't simply a question of Indigenous and versus foreign. I think there's something about firms and industries, resources and capabilities. Another clue, I think, comes from, say, the issue about wages. I think the empirical evidence that Frank and Michael draw upon about scale and size of firm explaining wages is part of the story. But it's also true that we know from the efficiency wage data that even within industries, the different firms within the same industry tend to have different wage structures. So in other words, there are some firms within an industry that just pay more than other firms in the same industry, irrespective of occupation within that industry. So I suspect that further digging might see that issue. So I think tying that together, that first sort of set of observations, I think that there's issues about the resources that different firms had and their capabilities, what firms are good at doing. And I think the clue there, that sort of Frank said at the end about the similarity of tariff jumpers, the Indigenous firms, I think there's a clue there about developing future research along that line. So that's the first set of observations. And just the second set of observations are, again, more hand-wavy, because Alan, I'm sure, can talk much more detail about trade policy than I could ever. But that is to say, in terms of governance, political economy, tech trade, we know from economic historians like Nick Crafts, Barry Eichengreen, in terms of the issue about industrial policy, when it works and when it doesn't. But one of the things that Nick Crafts, Barry Eichengreen, etc., pointed out that the power of lobbying in terms of distorting industrial policy for when it does or doesn't work. And I think this reminds us that entrepreneurship, again, it can be good, bad, or indifferent for overall growth. So I think that, when we look at the model of industrial policy developed in Ireland, I couldn't help but notice the discussion or mention in the paper about advanced factories. Okay, now that's interesting because if we look within Britain, the Scottish model was to invest the resources into infrastructure and public sector housing and not go for advanced factories. In Northern Ireland, it was the opposite. The public housing was underfunded, but advanced factories were developed, and it doesn't seem a million miles from suggesting there was some imitation of the Northern Irish advanced factories models within the South that emerges over time, which, you know, given the similarity of the people involved in advising both North and South, we probably shouldn't be surprised that there's some similarity. But unlike Northern Ireland, I think the IDA was far more successful at being at arm's length from politicians. There wasn't the conflict of interests problems that I think we can show in the Northern Irish case between, say, 1945 and 63. So I think that there are clues there in the paper about what makes for successful and unsuccessful experiments in industrial policy. And I think that, again, this takes us back into the discussion of firms and industries, resources and capabilities. So in terms of just observations, I think I completely accept what Frank said, his comments regarding econometric evidence. I do think, however, there's a lot of scope for further archival digging. And I think this research offers a very valuable framework, not just for understanding the particular Irish case, but more generally offering a really good antidote to the sort of simplistic literature that now even exists about successful and unsuccessful industrial policy. I think what this set of research suggests is a much more contingent sort of approach to the topic. So all in all, I hope my sort of jumbled comments without PowerPoint, I hope make some sense. And I'll pass on now to Alan and far more lucid contribution from Alan. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Alan the Bromhead from UCD will give a second vote. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to offer a vote of thanks. I'm delighted to be able to do so. This is a really insightful and interesting paper. What I'm going to do, and I think this is just a very brief overview, but what I would like to do is just to highlight some of the places where I think this paper really does make a contribution, and it does make a valuable contribution to our understanding of the development of manufacturing industry in Ireland over the 20th century. So I just want to sort of highlight some of those aspects, but then also do some just sort of, as Graham says, some hand waving stuff, just trying to outline some things that jumped into my head when I was reading this paper, and really around the understanding of what these findings kind of how these findings came about. So, oh yeah, there we go. So firstly, just to reiterate Frank's points, just to and commend the authors on their incredibly detailed data work. Okay, and anyone who's done research of this kind will recognize that what we see on the presentations, what we see in any individual data point is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the work that is involved. So this is a really commendable aspect of this paper, and it really does take just the spade work for people to do this. And I think really where the greatest sort of value added that comes from this approach, where this lies, is in the identification of foreign ownership. And this is not something that is easily ascertained from any sort of aggregate data. Any aggregate data we have will tell you just the sort of the broad strokes of things. But really to separate out Indigenous from foreign is really important here. And I think that's probably one of the most important aspects. And, you know, Frank already mentioned that, you know, the general pattern, the general finding of this paper, and I think this is the most interesting aspect. It sort of supports the idea that the foreign establishments that were export oriented seem to have been able to defy geography in some way, whether by choice or by inducement, in a way that earlier foreign firms didn't. Okay, you know, maybe with some exceptions, but in general, that seems to be the overall pattern that seems to come out. So I guess I'd like to sort of talk a little bit more about the answer to why that might have been, and Frank kind of referenced that at the end of his presentation. You know, and this gives sort of some good empirical backing to Mary Daly's point, as Frank said, about the failure of industrial policy in the 1930s, in particular, to redistribute industry, although maybe there were some successes. But really, you know, to be able to do this, it requires this long-run approach that the authors have taken here. To really assess industrial policy does take a long-run view, because these policies can take a long time to actually bear fruit, to shape the economy, and it's really only with the long perspective that we can pass judgment on these policies. So I think that's a really useful contribution of this paper. One thing that I might sort of highlight, and it is completely understandable that the focus of this paper would be on the larger firms of 100 plus and even 500 plus. But there's clearly something that is interesting also going on in the smaller sized firms. Now, to collect information on those firms, I'm sure would be next to impossible. But still, I think it's worth acknowledging that these are probably playing an important role in this story as well. Just from research, previous research, looking at the sort of the location of these, or the size of these firms, 2/3 of funded plants in 72 had fewer than 100 workers. And the average size of new industry establishments in designated areas, as mentioned by O'Farrell, was 84 in designated areas and 167 in non-designated areas. So there's clearly differences between who's locating where and the size of these establishments. And it sort of indicates that these smaller establishments may also have been important in the story, although that's not to discount the role of the larger employers. Oh, well, we're on way. Okay. So next, I just want to sort of put some thoughts out there. Like any good piece of research, it's actually stimulating more questions than it's answering, and that's a really good thing. It's making us think about the answers to some of these important questions. And one thing I just wanted to also mention is I know I mentioned to Frank that we're working with Sean Kenny on looking at industrial production and trying to generate regional GDP figures for Ireland over the 20th century. And what we're using to sort of look at that is to look at productivity. And this is something that we can get at a regional level. Okay? We can't get at the individual firms, which means we can't really identify who they are. But we can look at sort of broad patterns in terms of productivity. And I think that's also an important part of the story. Employment clearly was a motivating factor for regional policy to bring jobs to regional areas. But as Frank said, another reason was these were high-paying jobs. Right? If you have a bigger industry, they tend to be, or a bigger establishment, they tend to pay higher wages. So this effect is important, and particularly if we're looking at new industries and foreign-owned firms, we would expect maybe that they are more they're higher productivity firms. So as this pattern changes of where these firms are locating, we would think that the new industries that are foreign-owned locating in more peripheral regions are going to actually be more productive also in terms of output per worker. So this is sort of some preliminary work we've done, trying to map from the Census of Industrial Production the output per worker or relative output per worker in different counties across the 20th century. So I won't go into this in too much detail, but the general pattern that we see does support what Frank is also observed in terms of the largest firms, that Dublin is, over this entire period, losing its sort of relative share, not just in the size in large firms, but also in output per worker in this period. So the advantage that Dublin has in industrial output per worker is declining. There is some evidence that that there is some convergence in output per worker across counties in the earlier period, and that this reaches a sort of a low point or a high point in terms of equality, a low point in terms of inequality in around the 60s and 70s. And this is when there's least dispersion in output per worker by county in Ireland. What we see when we move on towards the 1980s and 1990s is this gap opens up again. And partly that is a pattern that we see across many countries in Europe. But what's interesting about the Irish pattern is it seems to be driven as much by the successes of regional policy, and that there's some counties do very, very well, obviously, from this process, but there are many counties that are still left behind in the in industrialization, and they continue to perform poorly across the 20th century. But that's forthcoming work, hopefully. Well, it's ongoing work with Sean Kenny that we're going to look at more. So I suppose the big question, going back to what I mentioned earlier, the big question is, why does regional policy seem to work post 1960, but not before? And Frank has highlighted some of the big changes that are going on, and these are the things we need to try and understand to try and figure out why we get this change or reversal in the 1960s. And there are both national and international factors. Frank has mentioned a few, and I'll probably throw a few more complicated factors and interactions into the mix just for discussion. Obviously, we have this opening up of trade in general in the sort of 1960s and 1970s. This is an opportunity to follow a new model. Okay? You can't really do an export-led model when everyone else is protecting, right? This makes a sort of a case for makes a protectionist model less costly. Possibly Ireland is a bit slow in off the mark in developing a new model. But these opportunities are also a threat in terms of the new environment. It's going to be a very competitive environment. It's interesting to highlight the concerns of the government in the run-up to EC accession. This is a quote from a memorandum to the government on the negotiations, and it's worrying about the very factors that it's trying to combat at home in terms of the distribution of economic activity. Okay, and a full-scale economic and monetary union would create powerful economic forces which would tend to attract the mobile forces of production, labour and capital to the most efficient centres of production and the areas of highest economic activity. This would have serious implications for this country, which is faced with high unemployment, emigration, comparatively small industrial sector, and a lower rate of economic growth than the existing community. So what was potentially a benefit to the Irish economy in terms of being able to pursue this export-led model is also potentially a threat. And it was, I think, we have to hand it to the Irish negotiators to manage to maintain, and they lobbied hard and managed to get this the EC on accession to allow Ireland to continue the model that it had began in the 1960s in terms of support for exporting industries, for exemptions and for subsidies that are available. So this could have been a threat, but Ireland manages to sort of carve out this exception to the threat that was coming from EC competition. So the finding again that these early tariff jumpers were locating, or were not seen to locate in peripheral areas. I think this is kind of sums up what Frank has already said, and I just want to see the references in the paper. Just wanted to pay a little more attention to it. That it makes sense that these sort of early tariff jumpers who were trying to serve a domestic market might want to locate close to population, right? Where the market is, where they're going to sell it. They were low value to weight items. You know, if we think about bread or biscuits, okay, these are things that are going to be low value to weight compared to what the new industries, as Frank said, are going to be offering. And it's, if you are serving foreign markets, then the domestic part of the transport cost is not going to matter as much for you when you're selling to an international market. So sort of all of these things are reducing the importance of the local transport costs in Ireland, and sort of reducing the negative effects of plurality that might have held back this sort of earlier industrialization in peripheral areas. Okay, so that's the sort of market forces that are being driven by the opening up of trade. But clearly there are other factors we need to consider in this, and this is a complex picture, and there's a lot changing around this time in Ireland as well as internationally. So you know, what role do transport and communication changes play in this story? Do these hinder or help in terms of the regional distribution of industry? Yes, these things probably, you know, the rationalization of rail in Ireland, does that maybe impede the sort of tariff jumping internal market integration, but maybe matters less when your lighter industry is what you're exporting. Okay, so these sort of things are important. We have obviously structural change in Ireland. We're moving from an agricultural economy to an industry and services economy, and there is this nice footnote in the paper that highlights how reluctant firms were, or the difficulties that firms had in hiring ex-agricultural workers to work in industry. I mean, one thing we need to understand is how that process actually happened. How did these companies that were locating find the necessary skills, and how much did policy play in that in terms of upskilling the population at a national level, but particularly because structural change is you know, happening in the west of the country, and there are more people sort of leaving agriculture and needing to find employment, and how that process was managed in this period. How much does population decline play a factor in this? Does the end of population decline in the 1960s lead to sort of more certainty, more you know, for the future, for investment? If you're thinking of investment in a particular area, maybe you're thinking about how many people are leaving and what's the labor market going to look like. These are important things that change around this time as well. And another thing that I think is probably important in some way, and we can sort of see this today as well in the consistency of Irish policy towards multinational corporations, and they sort of bend over backwards to try and convince multinationals that we're going to stick to the plan that we signed up to many moons ago, and nothing is going to change that. Because these inducements, these exemptions, these export subsidies, when they were offered over a very long time frame. And what you need in order to make that a credible commitment is some sort of institutional stability. You want to be sure that this isn't going to get revoked the next time the government changes, or even when Ireland enters the EC, that they will work hard to try and retain what they had promised you. So Ireland seems to manage this pretty well and manage to convince multinational corporations that there isn't going to be an abrupt change in policy anytime soon, and that the promises that were made, even by previous governments, will be honoured by the current governments. Okay, and this might be an important part of the story also, that might take time to actually develop and to get convinced. Okay, so I'm just finished up. Then, of course, we have to wonder why Ireland is different. Other countries are trying to play this game. There's a competition for these sort of footloose industries that are going to play this exporting model. What made Ireland different? What was the combination of factors, including the support from the IDA and the Irish government, that made Ireland the place for location of these industries? Okay, so just to finish then, to congratulate the authors again for a really, really nice paper. So thank you.
Okay, so for those online, just put up your hand, or those in person. We're up for questions. So Sean and John.
Yeah, thanks to Frank and Michael for a great paper. I just wondered, have you considered doing a decomposition that gets at whether the spatial dispersion of industry took place mostly within sectors, or whether the sectoral composition change could have explained a lot of it? So this might get at partly how much space there is for policy to have determined this net dispersion that took place. And I'm thinking in particular, there are sectors internationally that, like paper and publishing or brewing, that are pretty concentrated in every place you find them. Is it the relative decline of those sectors that act and the rise of things like food processing or whatever that might help to explain this?
John? Yeah.
Fascinating database, a huge amount of work, and it offers opportunities. And there are two areas, the labour markets, I think would be interesting, because you have the precise location of factories. It would be interesting to look at the effect on immigration from those locations. There's very little, in 1965, my father was running for the Senate, and she took us around the country. I remember he went into a county councillor's house in Galway and looked at his first vote. And the councillor said he was emigrating, there was no future, and he's going to Manchester. My father said, this was in Galway, he said, but there are lots of jobs in Shannon. And the guy would not conceive of moving within Ireland. He might move to Dublin. So the local labour market effects of the factories would be very significant. So a new factory opens up. If it substantially reduces immigration, you can see why politically it should be hugely attractive to people locally, that their children, instead of emigrating, find a future. So it'd be interesting to look at, because you have the precise location, to look at the immigration from the local area. Now it's a whole nother paper, but that would be interesting. Second thing, and I presume you don't have data on whether the employment was male or female, which would also help in that regard. Like if it was clothing, which was predominantly female, the women wouldn't emigrate, but the men would. You'd see, did it differentially affect migration by gender, which would be interesting. And second, on the labour market, the wage rate effects. I remember hearing once again, I thought I did a lot of work in this area in the 60s, that if a factory moved into a town, it paid, as you say, much more, but it had ripple effects locally. So you could only have one factory in the town. If you had another, it was going to crowd out, given that nobody would move to Clara from anywhere else in Ireland. So there's the labour market effects. And what happened, published papers looking at what happened to wage rates in Ireland in manufacturing, and even if you break it down, in the 30s up to 1960 were 60% of the GB rate, and people were emigrating to earn more. But between 1960 and 1970, there was a convergence in wage rates. And I've looked at the cost of emigration, and that doesn't explain it. So is there, did the new factories disproportionately leverage up wage rates? So probably the data on that probably are not available, while in migration you could do it looking at the wage rate effects would be difficult. And two other things, you mentioned weight and exports, and Alan made this point as well. I think John Bradley and myself, we did a paper on the likely effects of the single European market in Ireland in 1992. And one of the things was, well, it would reduce the transport costs. And one of the things which was surprising was some transport costs for manufacturing in Ireland were 4% of gross output, and that was the same in Europe. But Joe Durkin and Aisling Renan-Fian did a study which showed the reason was that Ireland had specialised into high value to weight exports, or exports even by 1990 were extremely valuable by weight. So that suggests that that's important. I spent quite an amount of time in the Irish Railway Record Society trying to dig out the cost of somebody going from Galway to Manchester since 1920. But there could be data there on the transport costs. And if you think of the bakery and it's the energy like low value or high value and sold locally, but the energy for that would have come from coal, and shipping the coal to the middle of Ireland to make their biscuits would have been very expensive. So I think that the transport costs might repay more research. The final thing is the political economy of this. I don't know who it was saying that going through the records of the Department of Industry and Commerce, did you get these letters writing in saying, I want to set up a factory and I'm a good party member. It is the relationship between the own, and I'm sure political parties never had formal records of who was members, but that aspect, the interaction between manufacturing and in particular Fianna Fáil over the period, with one influencing the other, I think would be interesting. And so you have certainly you have the factories, you have the going further, if you knew the owners, it'd be interesting in terms of what their politics were.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask you about the size classes that you use, because generally the accepted definition of small is less than 50, or it is now even. Maybe in 1926 it was different, it was greater, but so it's less than 50, micro is less than 10, then you've less than 250, 50 to 250 is medium, and then greater than 250 is large. So if you start doing numbers on that basis, you can get, like, for example, if you started doing productivity calculations, you'll get very different results. And if you're trying to compare the data across countries, it's going to be very different, I think. So that's just a point. If you have company data, you can do it, because you know it's not that you're stuck with the aggregates on a given classification. But that's, I think, the generally accepted classification, small, medium, and large. I was just wondering, when you're going through it, was there much evolution of companies? Did they evolve from, say, family companies to publicly owned corporations? So they're not in there might be even a partnership or something, not be in it initially, then they go into one of these size classes, and then they move up over time. And I don't know if you said it much about that, or whether there was mergers and this going on to like corporate events that were changing the look of this distribution. I think that's all it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Just one other question. Most of the figures that you presented from 26 to 75 are stock figures by and large. Have you done any work on births and deaths?
Yeah. Good. For once, I might use my chair position and just add something. So one thing is, so market orientation is important here, right? You're seeing these traditional industries needing to be close to the consumer base, right? And then you kind of wonder, even with these new industries, why they're locating outside. But I often wondered with land ownership, we saw a lot of derelict and people holding on to land for long periods in Dublin, even up to a point where the financial service sector came in and social media, etc. Right? So maybe it's not so easy to get land and land redistributed for alternative use, particularly in industry. It's just not. So it's a better proposition to go outside of Dublin for that reason, right? So that's all around planning and people holding an asset to get the best return and all that sort of stuff, right? The other things, the heat map definitely showed BMW booming. When you were looking at the big movers, that was a BMW. And I'm just wondering whether the policies, how strong those policies were for particularly the multinationals for BMW regions. It seemed to come out strong. And lastly, I think this is
thinking, you probably don't know what BMW is.
Border Midland and West. Border Midland and West, and you saw that in your map.
Yeah.
And then finally, the Hirschman linkages. Like we all know that getting the big companies in can mean that there's a lot of, in other sectors like restaurants and taxis, you know, that we know there's a lot of boost in terms of other businesses and small businesses spinning around those. which obviously you can't get at in this paper, but nonetheless, you're looking at the structural features, it's still structurally very good. So do you want to respond to all of those?
Yeah,
Frank?
yeah,
And-
sure. Oh my God.
Well, actually, not all of them,
No.
we'll try and get out in 5 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks a lot. There's plenty of room for thought. Let me kind of group questions into well, to the extent that I can. So Michael and Jerry ask about, so firms move between size classes. Oh, a point is that, and I don't know whether I said it or not, we don't have exact employment data for we know the employment data for the firms and the large establishment, 500 plus, just generally they're easy enough to find the employment data. A lot of the employment data pertaining to the firms in the 100 employee to 499 is through interpolation, isn't that that's the term that we use? So we don't have exact employment data for a lot of those. If we did, we'd use it, so we don't. As to firm births and deaths, yeah, we have that in, particularly, for foreign firms coming in, their firm births. We haven't tracked the death of firms so much because it's not something that we're just focusing on firms moving into these particular categories. So, but I know that's kind of ultimately probably where we'll want to go with this, because it'll be important for measuring firm performance, But a general point is really what we have vast amounts of data here, as you can see. What we really hope to do is interest you econometricians here in using these kind of data. We're prepared to make it available to you, under certain restrictive conditions. Nothing to do with money, you know what I'm talking about. No, but really, this is why we wanted to present it to this forum, because the bring forum to do that is to say, you guys might have econometric ideas that these data can be used to test, and we're really open to that. So that kind of covers quite a multitude. Oh, one thing Graham said, yeah, if we had the wage data initially about 20 years ago, when I started thinking about this, it was wage data that I was after, because I wanted to know, we know more modern export-oriented multinationals pay a wage premium over, non-multinationals. And we don't know whether that applied to tariff jumpers or not. And I thought initially that's kind of what I was looking for. There's no kind of database that we can use to get a handle on the wage element. I'd love to. And actually what started me off thinking about that was when the debates were taking place over FINAFO's Control of Manufacturers Acts in the early 1930s over whether they should restrict tariff jumping or not. Some people claimed the multinationals, the British firms, would tariff jump into Ireland and would pay wages that Indigenous firms couldn't afford. Whereas others said, no, they'll come in and they'll pay sweatshop wages. So I wanted to know which of those actually turned out to be the case. And we don't know, unfortunately. Too many other questions for me to deal with, but plenty of food for thought. So thank you to everybody.
Thanks. So, announcements.
Well, no announcements other than the next meeting, I believe, is on Thursday, the 26th of January. So we look forward to
Probably the Barrett lecture.
that.
And then, even though we've recorded everything here, if you want to submit any of those questions, and we'll publish them. If you want to make them coherent and write them up into little paragraphs, we'll actually publish them on the Q&A as well as the discussants. So please do that. I think it's secretary@ssi.ie.
Secretary@ssi.ie, or you can email them to me directly.
Here.whelan@ecd.ie. Okay, and finally, just thanks to everyone online. I see John Bradley and lots of familiar faces. So very much appreciate that you come online, and enjoy your holidays and run up to the holidays. And thanks for the excellent paper today. It's very thought provoking. So well done, everyone. Okay, thank you.